Free Japan to Now, number 94. Today, August 7th, Thursday. The time is 4 p.m. Good afternoon, everybody. How is your summer? Here in Yokohama, midsummer is now going by, and the wind is a bit cooler than July. I feel some step of autumn in the wind. How do you feel about your summer? Today's FGC topic is the tragedy of Fumimaro Konoe. Maybe almost all of you are not so familiar with Fumimaro Konoe. He is very famous, still famous in Japanese history, in the modern Japanese history. He is a 20th century person. But in other countries, Konoe is not so familiar, is not so known. Therefore, the FGC's role comes up. Here in this FGC, we have to talk about Konoe's role and Konoe's significance in the pre-war era and during the war era. Konoe was born at the end of 19th century. He is approximately the same age as Adolf Hitler. Therefore, still now, Konoe is sometimes compared to Hitler in Germany. Of course, we now know that Konoe was not a dictator as Hitler did or Hitler was in Germany. Nevertheless, Konoe played a very significant role in 1930s and 1940s. His name Konoe means in Japanese that he is derived from aristocratic ancestry. In fact, this Konoe family is a paramount family in Japanese novels. Therefore, all Japanese can feel something when they hear the name Konoe. There are several familiar names here in Japan which designate the aristocratic ancestry. For example, Saionji, or Kitashirakawa, or Kuninomiya, or something like that. Konoe was, in this sense, very good in his blood lineage. And he graduated from Kyoto University in the pre-war period. It was 1920s. At that time, Kyoto University was very famous for philosophy and modern economics. Konoe got the cutting-edge knowledge about philosophy, politics, and economics in Kyoto University. And he married very early, and he was very tall, good looking. Therefore, from early on, he was a candidate of the future prime minister. In 1920s and 1930s, Saionji was the man who decided the prime minister at that time. Saionji was in this position because of his background As I said, Saionji was also aristocratic family, and he is one of the descendants of this Saionji family, and he collaborated with Hirobumi Ito, who was the founder. Hirobumi Ito was the founder of modern Japan in Meiji era. Therefore, Saionji, Kimochi Saionji, was very trusted by Showa Emperor at the time, and he was in the position to decide the prime minister at the final stage. So, in a sense, Saionji was the kingmaker, and this Kimochi Saionji expected that Fumimaro Konoe would be a good and long prime minister in Japan, and so Konoe would direct the government and people in the right direction. This was the expectation from Saionji to Konoe. Konoe was very talkative person. Here, talkative is not a negative word. He could talk with almost everybody, from right-wing people, so nationalist people, to left-wing people, even communists. Curiously enough, around Konoe, there was so variety of people who were very different from each other in their thinking. Konoe was a person who could embrace this variety. However, he was very irresolute because of these various opinions which he heard. He was a prime minister in 1930s and 1940s. At first, he was still 45 or so, comparatively young prime minister, and the great expectation from Japanese people and media also extolled this young leader at that time. Therefore, he had a big political power, and he could use it. He could exert it when he would. But Konoe didn't. Konoe was always irresolute. He couldn't decide immediately. He always consulted with various people, many persons. And after that, he drew some conclusion, and then he changed it. In Konoe's political career, there were so many such episodes which unfortunately showed Konoe's irresolution. For example, Japan-Sino War broke out in 1937 in July. At the time, the first Konoe cabinet, and Konoe surely ordered that Japanese army shouldn't expand the conflict. At first it was conflict, not the war. But he couldn't restrain the aggression of Japanese army, although he could do it when he would. Later, in 1940s, Japan was confronted with a war with the United States of America. At that time, Konoe cabinet was the second and third. At this time, Konoe always reiterated that he would go to Honolulu, he would go to Washington to talk with President Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, to stop the war. He said those words many times, but he couldn't do anything to stop the war in the domestic level. For example, Konoe didn't suppress the voice of war in the army and navy. As usual, Konoe consulted with the top of army, at the time Tojo, and the top of the navy, at the time Oikawa. Always consulted. Consultation was the most that Konoe could do at that time. Unfortunately, he was not the leader of emergency. He was not the leader of emergency. And Japan-Sino War continued for, how long was it? Continued 8 years. And Japan-US War continued almost 4 years. These two conflicts or wars broke out at Konoe cabinet. This was the tragedy of Konoe and tragedy of modern Japan, in my opinion. If it were the other more active prime minister, Japanese modern history would have been different totally. Prime Minister Konoe could have avoided the war if he had had the intention. But he didn't in reality. He couldn't stop the war. The intention of Showa Emperor was always to avoid the war. And Konoe was very familiar with it because he was in the position to talk with Showa Emperor at that time so many times. Therefore, the intention of Showa Emperor to stop the war or to avoid the war was a matter of course for Konoe himself. However, he couldn't carry it out. After the end of the Pacific War, so World War II, Konoe was indicted by Tokyo Court, Tokyo Far East Court, and he committed suicide before being summoned to prison. Konoe wrote that he couldn't put up with saying some excuses in the court, in the tribune. He couldn't. He didn't want to do it. And he killed himself by the medicine. The tragedy of Konoe was literally the tragedy of modern Japan. He was so expected by many people, but he couldn't live up to the expectation. If it had been the other era, Konoe could have been better prime minister in the peaceful time, for example. But the Konoe's inauguration time, it was two times, so 1933 and 1940. Both were the most imminent time for Japan or Japanese government, and his irresolution was in the worst way devastating Japan itself. The tragedy of Konoe was tragedy of modern Japan. Now, in August was the month that the Pacific War ended by the declaration of Showa Emperor. So this is a month that all Japanese remember the Pacific War. Now, I remember Konoe himself, and it was a great unfortunate coincidence that Konoe was in his cabinet when the war broke out. Thank you.